Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the Great Smoky Mountains, not the version you see on postcards or in travel brochures, with golden light filtering through the canopy and families posing beside scenic overlooks. We're going to the other version, the version that people in East Tennessee still talk about in quiet voices more than 50 years later. This is the story of Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old boy from Knoxville who went on a camping trip with his dad, his grandpa, and his older brother over Father's Day weekend in 1969. He was playing a game with the other kids, the kind of harmless, silly game that children have played for as long as there have been children. And then he was gone, just like that. In a matter of minutes, Dennis walked behind a bush and was never seen again. What followed was the largest search effort in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Hundreds, then over 1,000 people combed those ridges and hollows looking for one small boy in a red shirt. The FBI got involved. The army sent Green Berets. Helicopters circled overhead. And after all of it, after all those people and all those hours and all that heartbreak, they found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a shoe, not a single definitive clue. Before we settle in, if you enjoy what we do here and the way we tell these stories, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you want to. No pressure. And I genuinely appreciate it. And if you're listening on Spotify, the link is in the description. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's always someone out there listening at some quiet hour, wondering what happened to a little boy in the mountains all those years ago. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a little if you can. If you've got headphones in, settle into your pillow. This is a long one, and it deserves to be told slowly, because Dennis deserves that. His family deserves that. Have you ever wondered what it's like when someone just vanishes? Not in the way people disappear in cities, where there are cameras on every corner and cell phone pings to track, but in the wild, in 500,000 acres of ancient forest, where the mountains themselves seem to swallow sound. Have you ever wondered what those first hours feel like for a parent, when calling your child's name into the trees produces nothing but silence and the echo of your own voice? Have you ever thought about what it takes for hope to survive 15 days of searching and finding nothing at all? Tonight, we're going to walk through all of it, every detail we know, every theory that's been offered, every mistake that was made, and every lesson that was learned from them. And we're going to do it with the care and the respect that Dennis and his family deserve. Let's begin. To understand what happened to Dennis Martin, you have to understand the place where it happened. Not just the geography, though that matters enormously. You have to understand what the Great Smoky Mountains were in 1969 and what they meant to the people who lived in their shadow. Because this is not just a story about a missing child. It is a story about a place, a vast and ancient and beautiful place that holds secrets the way the ocean holds depth, silently and without apology. The Great Smoky Mountains straddle the border between Tennessee and North Carolina like a spine of ancient stone and forest, running northeast to southwest for about 70 miles. They are, by almost any measure, among the oldest mountains on Earth. Not the tallest, not anymore, not after hundreds of millions of years of wind and water and ice wearing them down, but old. Unimaginably old. The rocks beneath the soil in some parts of the Smokies date back more than 1 billion years, which is a length of time the human brain really cannot hold on to no matter how hard it tries. The park itself covers more than 502,000 acres. That is 816 square miles of dense forest, rushing streams, rocky ridges, and deep hollows where sunlight barely reaches the ground. There are places in the Smokies where you can walk for a full day and never cross a road. There are valleys where the morning fog settles so thick that you can barely see your own hand in front of your face, which is actually where the mountains get their name. That bluish haze, that smoky mist that clings to the peaks and drifts through the valleys, comes from the natural oils released by the millions of trees that blanket these slopes. Hemlock and spruce and Fraser fir up high, red maple and yellow birch and tulip poplar lower down. The forest is alive in a way that very few places in the eastern United States still are. By 1969, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park had been officially designated for about 35 years. President Franklin Roosevelt dedicated the park in 1940, standing at the Rockefeller Memorial at Newfound Gap, looking out over waves of misty ridgelines that stretched as far as the eye could see. Even then, it was already becoming one of the most visited parks in the national park system. Families from Knoxville and Gatlinburg and Maryville and all the little towns scattered through the Tennessee Valley had been coming to these mountains for generations, long before there was a park at all. The Smokies were their backyard, their church, their playground. The year 1969 was a strange and extraordinary time in America. In just the first 6 months of that year, Richard Nixon had been inaugurated as president in January. The Vietnam War was raging, with 500,000 American troops stationed in Southeast Asia. Anti-war protests were spreading across college campuses. In April, the army had begun secretly bombing Cambodia. The civil rights movement was still reverberating from the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy the previous year. The Stonewall riots would erupt in New York City later that same month of June. And in July, just weeks after Dennis Martin disappeared, Neil Armstrong would set foot on the moon. But in the mountains of East Tennessee, the rhythms of life moved at a different pace. The Smokies had their own calendar, marked not by headlines, but by dogwood blooms in April and firefly shows in June and the first frost of October, turning the ridgelines to gold and crimson. People in Knoxville and the surrounding communities lived close to these mountains in a way that is difficult for outsiders to fully appreciate. The Smokies were not a vacation destination that you visited once a year. They were the landscape you saw every morning when you looked out your kitchen window. They were the place where your grandfather had hunted and fished and where your parents had courted. They were woven into the identity of the region in a way that was so fundamental it was almost invisible, like the air itself. Cades Cove was one of the most beloved spots in the entire park. A broad, flat valley ringed by mountains, it had once been home to a thriving community of Appalachian settlers. By the late 1960s, the old homesteads and churches and barns were preserved as historic sites along an 11-mile loop road that wound through the valley floor. Families would drive through slowly, stopping to photograph white-tailed deer grazing in the fields or black bears ambling along the tree line. In the spring, the wildflowers were extraordinary. In the fall, the foliage turned the mountains into something that looked like it had been painted by someone with a very generous sense of color. The Martin family knew Cades Cove well. They knew the trails that led out of the valley and up into the higher elevations. They knew the shelters and the camping spots and the places where the mountain laurel bloomed in June. For generations, the men of the Martin family had kept a tradition. Every Father's Day weekend, they would pack up and head into the Smokies for a camping trip. It was their thing, a ritual of fathers and sons heading into the mountains the way their fathers and grandfathers had done before them. In 1969, the group consisted of 4 people. William Martin, known as Bill, was the father. Clyde Martin was Bill's father, the grandfather. Douglas Martin, 9 years old, was Bill's older son. And Dennis Lloyd Martin, 6 years old, just a few days shy of his 7th birthday, was the youngest. This would be Dennis's first overnight camping trip in the wilderness. He'd been on family hikes before, short ones that stayed close to the roads and the campsites. But this year, for the first time, he was going to sleep under the stars in the backcountry, following the trails that the Martin men had walked for decades. Dennis was, by all accounts, a small and quiet boy. He had dark brown wavy hair and large dark brown eyes with long eyelashes. He was about 4 feet tall and weighed roughly 55 pounds. He was playful and curious, the kind of child who liked being outdoors, who kept pace with the bigger kids, even though he was the littlest one in the group. His family described him as energetic, but not reckless, a boy who liked to run ahead on the trail, but never too far. He had a German shepherd dog at home named Lady. He had just finished kindergarten. Summer had arrived, and Dennis was ready for an adventure. The Martin family also had a mother, Violet, and other siblings, including a brother named Michael and a sister named Sarah. But the Father's Day tradition was specifically for the men and boys, and so it was Bill, Clyde, Douglas, and Dennis who set out on the morning of June the 13th, 1969, a Friday, driving from their home on Murray Road in Knoxville to the trailhead at Cades Cove. The plan was a familiar one. They would enter the park at Cades Cove and hike out along the trail that followed Anthony Creek up toward the main ridge of the Smokies. The first leg would take them along the trail past the junction with the Crib Gap Trail, climbing steadily through the forest. Their destination for the first night was Russell Field, a grassy clearing at high elevation with sweeping views across the ridgeline. There was a shelter cabin there, the kind of simple, 3-sided wooden structure that the park maintained along the Appalachian Trail for hikers and campers. From their home in Knoxville, the drive to Cades Cove took about an hour. The hike from Cades Cove to Russell Field was roughly 5.5 miles along the Boat Mountain Trail, and then another 1.5 miles on the Appalachian Trail itself to reach the shelter. It was a meaningful hike, especially for a 6-year-old, climbing from the valley floor at about 1,800 feet in elevation up to nearly 4,900 feet at Russell Field. But the Martins were experienced. Clyde had done this hike for years. Bill had grown up doing it. Even 9-year-old Douglas had made the trek before. Dennis kept up. He walked the trail with his family through the hardwood forest and the wildflower meadows, past the sound of creeks tumbling over moss-covered rocks, under a canopy of leaves so thick that the light came through in dappled patches. He was a little boy in the mountains, with his dad and his grandpa and his big brother. It was the beginning of summer. Everything was green and warm and alive. They arrived at Russell Field sometime that Friday afternoon or evening and set up camp at the shelter. The clearing at Russell Field is a beautiful spot, open and grassy, sitting right along the Appalachian Trail, where the ridgeline runs roughly east to west. To the north, The drainage runs down into Tennessee, to the south into North Carolina. On a clear day, you can see for miles in every direction, ridge after ridge of mountains fading into that famous blue haze. The shelter at Russell Field was the kind of simple, rustic structure that hikers on the Appalachian Trail have relied on for decades. 3 walls and a roof, open on one side to the elements, with a hard wooden floor and maybe a firing nearby. It was not luxurious, but it was dry and it was shelter. And for the Martin men, it was tradition. Clyde had slept in this shelter years before. Bill had grown up sleeping in it. Now it was Dennis's turn. Imagine what that evening must have been like for Dennis. Picture a 6-year-old boy who has just completed the longest hike of his life, sitting at nearly 5,000 feet in the mountains, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple as the sun drops behind the ridgeline. The air is cooler up here than it was down in Cades Cove. The sounds are different too. Down in the valley, you hear cars and birds and the distant bark of a dog. Up here, there's only wind and birdsong and the occasional crack of a branch in the forest. Maybe a whip-poor will calling as the light fades. Maybe the low rustle of something moving through the underbrush. A raccoon or a deer or a black bear going about its evening business. For a child, this is magic. The world feels bigger up here, wilder, more alive. Your dad is right there beside you, and your grandpa and your big brother who has done this before and can show you where to put your sleeping bag and how to hang your food so the bears don't get it. You are part of something, part of a chain of fathers and sons that stretches back through the generations. You are doing what the Martin men do. That first night at Russell Field went smoothly. There's nothing in any account of this trip to suggest that anything was wrong. The Martins ate their dinner, watched the sun go down over the mountains, and slept in the shelter. Dennis was likely tired from the long hike, the longest he'd ever done. He was in the wilderness for the first time overnight, surrounded by the sounds of the forest at night, the crickets and the wind and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. It was an ordinary night in an extraordinary place. On Saturday morning, June 14th, the Martins packed up and continued east along the Appalachian Trail. Their destination for the second day was Spence Field, another highland meadow about 2.5 miles from Russell Field. Spence Field sits at roughly 4,900 feet and is one of the most well-known spots along this stretch of the Appalachian Trail. It is named for James Spence, a settler who lived in the area in the mid-1800s and grazed cattle on the high meadows. Like Russell Field, it's a grassy, open area along the ridgeline, bisected by the trail, with dense forest pressing in on all sides. The hike from Russell Field to Spence Field would have taken the family about 90 minutes, maybe a little longer with a 6-year-old in the group. The trail along the ridge is not particularly difficult, but it rises and falls as it crosses over knobs and through gaps, and there are sections where the path narrows and the forest crowds in close. The weather that Saturday morning was pleasant. June in the Smokies can be warm during the day and cool at night, and the forests at this elevation tend to be comfortable even in midsummer. When the Martins arrived at Spence Field, they found they were not alone. Another family was already camped there, and in one of those small coincidences that seem insignificant at the time but take on a strange weight in hindsight, this other family shared the same last name. They were also called Martin. This second Martin family led by a man who was a doctor, had two young boys of their own. They were unrelated to Bill Martin's family, just another group of campers who happened to be at the same spot on the same weekend with the same surname. The children from the two families quickly found each other, the way children always do. Douglas, who was 9, and the two boys from the other Martin family began playing together in the grassy field, while the adults talked and rested and took in the view. Dennis, at 6, was the youngest of the group, but eager to be part of whatever was happening. The mountain laurel was in bloom around the edges of the meadow, and the afternoon sun was warm. It was, by every measure, a picture of innocence. 4 boys playing in a mountain meadow on a Saturday afternoon in June, with their fathers and grandfather nearby, and it was in this setting, this gentle and unremarkable setting, that something went terribly wrong. The children hatched a plan. They were going to sneak up on the adults and scare them. It was the most ordinary kind of childhood mischief. They would slip away quietly, hide in the bushes or behind the trees at the edge of the meadow, and then burst out all at once with shouts and laughter. The adults would pretend to be startled. Everyone would laugh. It was the kind of game that had been played by children in fields and forests for centuries. The boys huddled together and worked out their strategy. Douglas and the 2 boys from the other family would go around one way, approaching from the south and west side of the field. Dennis, because he was wearing a bright red shirt that they worried would give them away, would go by himself around the other way, approaching from the northwest, closer to the Appalachian Trail and the tree line. This decision, made in a moment of simple, childish logic, would become the hinge on which everything turned. Bill Martin watched his youngest son step away from the other boys and move toward the edge of the meadow. He saw Dennis duck behind a bush near the tree line by the Appalachian Trail. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was still well above the horizon. Spence Field was open and grassy. There were people around. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. A few minutes later, the older boys burst out from their hiding spot. They shouted and laughed. The adults played along, feigning surprise. Everyone was smiling, but Dennis didn't come out. Bill waited a few moments, expecting to see the flash of red appear at the edge of the meadow, expecting to hear his youngest boy's laughter as he ran toward them. But there was nothing, just the grass rippling in the breeze and the tree line standing silent at the edge of the clearing. Between 3 and 5 minutes had passed since Bill had last seen Dennis step behind that bush. It was not a long time. A person might not even notice 3 to 5 minutes passing under normal circumstances, but Bill Martin felt something cold settle in his chest, the way a parent does when the silence goes on just a beat too long. He began to call for Dennis. His voice carried across the meadow and into the trees. He called again and again. There was no answer. Bill walked quickly toward the spot where he had last seen his son. He checked behind the bush. Dennis was not there. He looked up and down the Appalachian Trail. Dennis was not there either. He called the boy's name again, louder now, and the other adults stopped what they were doing and began to listen. The tone in Bill's voice had changed. Something was wrong. Bill Martin began to run. He followed the Appalachian Trail west from Spence Field toward Little Bald, nearly a mile away, calling Dennis's name the entire time. He ran until his voice was hoarse and his legs ached, scanning the trail and the trees and the brush on either side, looking for a flash of red, listening for a child's voice. He found nothing. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. He ran back to Spence Field. Dennis was still not there. The other adults had begun searching the immediate area around the meadow, checking behind rocks and in the thickets of mountain laurel, calling the boy's name into the forest on every side. Other people who were in the area, hikers and campers who had heard the commotion, began to help. Dennis Martin was gone. The next several hours unfolded with the kind of slow-building terror that anyone who has ever lost a child, even for a few minutes in a grocery store, can begin to imagine. Except this was not a grocery store. This was the backcountry of the Great Smoky Mountains, more than 5 miles from the nearest road, with darkness coming and the nearest ranger station hours away on foot. Clyde Martin, Dennis's 60-something-year-old grandfather, made the decision to hike down Boat Mountain to the nearest accessible point where he could reach help. This was a grueling descent, miles of trail through the forest in the fading daylight, and then a drive to the ranger station at Cades Cove. Dennis went missing around 4 in the afternoon. It was approximately 8:30 in the evening before Clyde reached the ranger station and reported the boy missing. That is 4.5 hours of Dennis being unaccounted for in the wilderness. 4.5 hours during which the sun went down and the temperature began to drop, and the forest around Spence Field grew dark and very, very quiet. While Clyde was making his way down the mountain, Bill stayed at Spence Field searching. Other people who were camped in the area joined him. Word spread among the hikers along that stretch of the Appalachian Trail that a child was missing. People searched with whatever light they had, calling Dennis's name into the darkness, moving through the meadow and into the edges of the forest, hoping to hear a small voice call back. And then the weather turned. A thunderstorm rolled into the Smokies that evening. Not a light rain, not a passing shower. A full-blown mountain thunderstorm that dumped 3 inches of rain in a matter of hours. The trails flooded. Streams that had been ankle-deep became raging torrents. The ground, which might have held footprints or other traces of a small boy's passage, was washed clean. Whatever trail Dennis might have left in the soil or the leaf litter was obliterated by the deluge. The temperature dropped. At nearly 5,000 feet of elevation, on a rainy night in June, the air at Spence Field fell to near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. For a 6-year-old boy in a red t-shirt and green shorts, with no shelter and no way to stay warm, that kind of cold could become dangerous very quickly. A child's body loses heat much faster than an adult's. Hypothermia can set in within hours, especially if the child is wet. Bill Martin stood in that rain, calling his son's name into the dark mountains, and received no answer. It is almost impossible to imagine what those hours were like for him. The helplessness, the desperate hope that Dennis had found shelter somewhere, a hollow log or an overhang of rock, that he was scared but alive, that he was just waiting to be found. And the other thing, the thing that must have been pressing at the edges of Bill Martin's mind, even as he refused to let it in, the possibility that his son was already beyond help. When the report reached the ranger station at Cades Cove, the Park Service mobilized immediately. Rangers Art Whitehead and John Nielsen drove up Boat Mountain Road in a Jeep, picked up Bill Martin along the way, and made their way as close to Spence Field as the road would allow. From the end of the Jeep trail, it was still a 1.5 mile hike up to the meadow. They talked to hikers and fishermen who had been in the area, asking if anyone had seen a small boy in a red shirt. No one had. By midnight, a small group of rangers and volunteers were at Spence Field, planning the search that would begin at first light. The rain was still falling, the forest was dark and soaked and impenetrable. Somewhere in those 522,000 acres of wilderness, Dennis Martin was alone. Or he was not alone. Or he was already gone. Nobody knew. And that not knowing was its own kind of agony. At 5 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, June 15th, the official search for Dennis Martin began. The dawn that broke over the Smokies that morning was grey and heavy. The storm from the night before had wrung itself out, but the forest was saturated. Water dripped from every leaf and branch. The trails were mud. The streams that normally ran clear were swollen and brown with runoff, pushing debris and silt downstream in a constant rush. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting wood, and that particular mineral scent that comes after a heavy rain in the mountains. Bill Martin had not slept. He had spent the night calling for his son, walking the edges of the meadow and the trail in the dark, listening for any sound that might be a child's voice. He was still wearing the clothes he'd hiked in. His voice was hoarse. When the first grey light appeared in the east, he was already on his feet, already moving, already searching. He would continue to search, in one form or another, for the next 45 years of his life. Those first hours of the search were marked by urgency and a kind of barely controlled chaos. The Park Service put together an initial crew of about 30 searchers, rangers, and volunteers who knew the terrain and could move quickly through the backcountry. They fanned out from Spence Field in every direction, following the Appalachian Trail east and west, dropping down into the drainages on both the Tennessee and North Carolina sides of the ridge, pushing through the mountain laurel thickets and the stands of spruce and fir that grew dense on the upper slopes. The terrain around Spence Field is not easy ground to search. The meadow itself is open and visible, but the moment you step into the tree line, the forest closes in. The ground drops away steeply on both sides of the ridge. Ravines cut deep into the mountainside, choked with fallen trees and boulders and tangles of rhododendron so thick that you have to crawl on your hands and knees to get through them. The undergrowth is lush and heavy, especially in June, when everything is at its peak of summer growth. A 6-year-old boy, even one wearing a bright red shirt, could be hidden by the vegetation within a few dozen yards of the trail and be completely invisible to a searcher walking past. Word spread quickly. By the end of that first day, the search party had swelled to more than 200 people. Park rangers came from across the Smokies. Volunteer search and rescue teams arrived from Blount County and Sevier County and other communities surrounding the park. Firefighters from the Knoxville Fire Department drove down to Cades Cove and hiked up to Spence Field. College students from nearby universities showed up to help. Even 2 groups of Boy Scouts who had been camping in the area joined the search. People wanted to help. A child was missing in the mountains, and the instinct to do something, to get out there and look, was overwhelming. But this instinct, as genuine and well-meaning as it was, would turn out to be one of the biggest problems of the entire search. The park had no established protocol for managing a search of this scale. Nothing like this had ever happened in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There was no incident command structure, no centralized leadership coordinating where the searchers should go and what areas had already been covered. Rangers were doing their best, but the sheer number of people flooding into the search area was creating confusion. Searchers were going over the same ground, that other searchers had already covered. They were walking through areas that had not yet been carefully examined, potentially stepping on footprints or other evidence without realizing it. The terrain that dogs might have been able to track through was being contaminated by hundreds of well-intentioned boots trampling through the mud and the wet leaves. One of the searchers on that first day was a young park ranger named Dwight McCarter. McCarter was an experienced tracker and woodsman who would go on to participate in hundreds of search and rescue operations over the course of his career. Years later, he would write about the Dennis Martin search and the lessons it taught. He remembered the chaos of those early hours, the overwhelming number of volunteers who arrived with no direction and no training, the way the search area was overrun before anyone had a chance to systematically examine it. All those people, McCarter would later say, referring to the searchers. That's a lot of footprints. All those trucks. They searched and searched and searched. Something should have been found. But you have to know what to look for. Get just a few trackers in first and give us a chance. But there was no time for careful tracking. A child was missing. The clock was ticking, and everyone believed that the next hour, the next search of the next ravine, would produce something. A shoe, a piece of fabric, a footprint, anything. The search expanded rapidly over the next several days. A helicopter was brought in to carry equipment up to Spence Field, where a base camp was established so that searchers would not have to hike up and down the mountain every day. 2 Huey helicopters were dispatched from the Warner Robins Air Force Base in Macon, Georgia. Fixed-wing aircraft flew over the ridgeline, looking for any sign of a red shirt against the green of the forest canopy. A command post was set up at the Cades Cove Ranger Station. The military involvement escalated in a way that surprised many people at the time and has continued to provoke questions ever since. The Tennessee Army National Guard sent personnel and equipment to assist with the search, but more unusually, a unit of approximately 60 U.S. Army Green Berets joined the effort. The official explanation was that the Green Berets happened to be in the area conducting a training exercise and were redirected to help with the search. This may well be true, but the presence of special forces in a missing child case was unusual enough that people noticed, and some found it difficult to reconcile with the stated circumstances. The Green Berets operated somewhat independently of the main search effort. Witnesses and other searchers noted that the special operations personnel kept to themselves, did their own thing, and did not always coordinate closely with the park rangers or the other volunteer groups. They set up their own base and conducted their own searches according to their own methods. Whether this was simply a matter of military operational culture, or whether there was some additional dimension to their presence, has never been fully clarified. By Tuesday, June 17th, 3 days into the search, a potentially significant piece of evidence was discovered. A set of child-sized footprints was found leading toward a stream. The tracks showed something peculiar. One foot appeared to be barefoot, while the other appeared to have been wearing an Oxford-type shoe, the same kind of shoe that Dennis Martin had been wearing on the day he disappeared. The tracks led to the stream and then vanished, as though the person who made them had walked into the water and either continued along the streambed or been carried away by the current. This discovery should have been a major lead. Child-sized footprints with one Oxford shoe in the area, where a 6-year-old boy wearing Oxford shoes had gone missing just days earlier, would seem, to most reasonable people, like something worth investigating thoroughly. But park officials examined the prints and determined that they had likely been left by a Boy Scout who was participating in the search. Their reasoning was that the prints could have been made by a somewhat larger child, and that the search area was now so contaminated by the foot traffic of hundreds of people that it was impossible to be certain. Dwight McCarter disagreed with this conclusion for the rest of his life. He pointed out that the tracks were not part of a group, suggesting they were made by someone walking alone, which would be unusual for a Boy Scout participating in an organized search. He also noted that none of the Boy Scouts in the area had been searching barefoot. Why would a single footprint show an Oxford shoe and the other be bare? That was consistent with a small child who had lost one shoe while walking through rough terrain, not with a uniformed Boy Scout conducting a search. The footprints were ultimately not followed up on in a meaningful way. The area had already been searched, officials noted, and the prints were not considered definitive enough to redirect the effort. It was a decision that McCarter and others would lament for decades. This is one of the great frustrations of the Dennis Martin case. A piece of evidence was found that was at least potentially consistent with the missing boy's movements, and it was dismissed based on an assumption that has never been verified. Were those Dennis's footprints? We will never know. But the decision not to pursue them meant that a possible trail, the only physical clue found during the entire search, was allowed to go cold. In the days that followed, the search took on a rhythm that was equal parts routine and desperation. Each morning, teams would gather at the base camp on Spence Field or at the command post in Cades Cove. They would receive their assignments, areas to search, ridges to walk, drainages to follow, and then they would spread out into the forest and spend the day pushing through brush and calling Dennis's name and looking behind every rock and under every log and into every hollow, hoping to find something, anything, that would tell them what had happened to this little boy. The search teams worked in lines, walking abreast through the forest at arm's length from one another, scanning the ground ahead of them. In open areas, this method covered ground efficiently, but in the dense rhododendron thickets and laurel hells that characterize so much of the Smoky's backcountry, the line would break apart within minutes. You simply cannot walk in a straight line through vegetation that comes up to your chest and intertwines overhead in a canopy so thick that you are essentially walking through a green tunnel. Searchers would get separated, lose sight of each other, and have to regroup, all while trying to maintain the systematic coverage that the operation required. The Boat Mountain Trail, which was the main access route from Cades Cove up to Spence Field, became a highway of foot traffic during the search. Jeeps and trucks drove up the 5.5 miles of road that were accessible to vehicles, and from the end of the road, everyone hiked the remaining 1.5 miles to the meadow. Supplies were carried in on foot or flown in by helicopter. Food, water, tents, communications equipment, and medical supplies all had to be hauled up the mountain. The logistics of supporting more than 1,000 people at a remote backcountry site were enormous, and the park had no precedent for managing an operation of this scale. On Wednesday, June 18th, 4 days into the search, the weather continued to complicate things. Heavy mist settled over the ridgeline, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The mist in the Smokies is not like fog in a city. It is dense and pervasive, and it comes and goes unpredictably, rolling in from the valleys and clinging to the mountaintops for hours or even days at a time. Searching in this kind of visibility is an exercise in frustration. You can barely see the person walking next to you, let alone a small child who might be lying unconscious in the undergrowth 50 feet away. Thursday, June 19th, brought a development that added a new dimension of concern to the search. Rangers investigated a report that a boy had been seen wearing clothing similar to what Dennis was wearing on the day he disappeared. This sighting, somewhere outside the immediate search area, raised the terrible possibility that Dennis had been taken out of the park entirely. If someone had abducted the boy, they could have been miles away by now, far beyond the reach of the ground search. The lead was investigated, but could not be confirmed, and it ultimately joined the growing pile of unresolved clues. Also that week, searchers encountered a decaying odor near the park boundary. In the context of a search for a missing child, this kind of report is devastating to receive and devastating to investigate. A team was dispatched to the area to determine the source of the smell. It turned out to be the carcass of a dog, not Dennis. But the moment of discovery, the moment of approaching the source of that smell and not knowing what you would find, is something that stays with a searcher. Friday, June 20th, was Dennis's 7th birthday. Picture that for a moment. The little boy whose disappearance had consumed the attention of an entire region, whose name was being called by hundreds of strangers across 56 square miles of wilderness, who had a German shepherd named Lady waiting for him at a house on Murray Road in Knoxville, turned 7 years old that day, or would have turned 7 if he was still alive. Nearly 800 people searched the mountains on Dennis's birthday. They walked the ridges and the hollows in the mist and the occasional rain, pushing through the rhododendron and the laurel and the dense stands of spruce, calling his name, looking for the red shirt, hoping that this would be the day. It was not the day. Meanwhile, the search continued to grow. By Saturday, June 21st, 1 week after Dennis had disappeared, an estimated 1,400 people were in the field searching. This was the peak of the effort. The searchers now included park rangers, county and state search and rescue officers, National Guard troops, Green Berets, firefighters, police officers, Boy Scouts, college students, and hundreds of ordinary citizens from the surrounding communities who had simply driven to the park and started walking into the woods. Former State Representative H.E. Bittle Jr. offered the use of his trained bloodhounds, scent tracking dogs that had been used successfully in other missing persons cases. But by the time the dogs were deployed, the situation was hopeless from a tracking standpoint. The rain had washed away whatever scent trail Dennis might have left in the hours after his disappearance. And even if some trace of scent remained, the thousands of people who had trampled through the search area over the past week had made it impossible for the dogs to isolate a single trail. "We never did get enough to run a track," Bittle later said. "We just didn't have nothing to go on, and there'd already been so many in and out of there." Congressman James Jimmy Quillen of Tennessee's 1st District contacted federal authorities and requested additional government assistance. The response was substantial. Multiple military command posts were established in or near the park, some of which appeared to be operating independently of the National Park Service and the FBI. Reports from the time indicate that President Richard Nixon was personally monitoring the situation and wanted to be kept updated on the search. Whether this level of presidential interest was simply a result of the case's growing national profile, or whether there were other factors at play, has never been fully explained. But the sheer scale of the government and military involvement in the search for one missing child was, and remains, unprecedented. Friday, June 20th, was Dennis Martin's 7th birthday. Nearly 800 people searched the mountains that day, walking through the rhododendron tunnels and the spruce groves and the rocky stream beds, calling a little boy's name into the forest. He had been missing for 6 days. The statistical probability of finding a lost child alive after this length of time in the wilderness was vanishingly small, and everyone involved in the search knew it. But they searched anyway, because you do, because you cannot stop looking when it is a child. That same day, the chief ranger began quietly developing a plan for what to do if Dennis was found dead rather than alive. This was a necessary and practical step, but it also marked a turning point in the emotional trajectory of the search. Hope was beginning to give way to something harder and colder. By Sunday, June 22nd, a full week and a day after Dennis had disappeared, the search had covered more than 56 square miles. 12.5 square miles had been intensively searched, meaning that teams had gone through the terrain systematically, looking behind every fallen log and inside every hollow and along every stream bank. The rest had been covered less thoroughly, but still walked and observed. The official narrative in the case file captured the mood at this point with a devastating simplicity. The logical search area had been reached. Nothing at all had been found. Think about that for a moment. More than 1,000 people had spent more than a week combing 56 square miles of forest and found absolutely nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of red fabric, not a fragment of bone, not a single piece of evidence that Dennis Martin had gone anywhere at all after stepping behind that bush at Spence Field. It was as though the mountain had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole, leaving not even a whisper behind. The search began to scale back after that. On Monday, June 23rd, the number of searchers dropped from over 1,000 to about 400. Each day brought fewer people to the field. The volunteers went home. The National Guard units were withdrawn. The Green Berets packed up their base and departed. The helicopter flights became less frequent and then stopped altogether. On Sunday, June 29th, 15 days after Dennis's disappearance, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park officially suspended all major search operations. A meeting was held that day with Dennis's parents, an FBI agent, the chief ranger, and 2 other park rangers to discuss the path forward. The points discussed at that meeting were painful in their pragmatism. There was no evidence to support a kidnapping. The chief ranger said the park was prepared to continue searching with 3 of its best men for up to 90 days, and that those 3 rangers could also manage any volunteer searchers who might come in. And so the search continued in a diminished form, with a handful of dedicated rangers walking the trails and ridges around Spence Field, looking for anything that might have been missed. But the massive, headline-grabbing operation was over. The circus of helicopters and Green Berets and hundreds of volunteers had moved on. The 3 park employees continued their search until September 13, 1969, 3 months after Dennis had vanished, and then that too came to an end. A letter written by the Great Smoky Mountains National Park superintendent around that time revealed that he and the assistant chief ranger shared a personal opinion. If Dennis Martin was ever found, they believed, he would be found within a few miles of the shelter near where he had disappeared. In the official after-action review completed in October 1969, park officials were candid about the failures of the search. The key takeaway, the report stated, was that because of how quickly the search developed, the park failed to realize the need for quick organization of manpower, overhead, and public relations. The report also noted that they lost manpower because many rescue squad members and volunteers were not properly equipped for backcountry searching. Park Superintendent Keith Nielsen wrote with unusual honesty in that review, "Everyone kept feeling that the boy would be found in the next hour, and it was probably this reason why the search organization did not keep pace with the rapid manpower buildup. We failed to realize the need for quick organization. It was the most intensive and large-scale search that any of the park personnel had ever participated in. Among the specific changes recommended for future searches were the need for a designated safety officer, for search dogs to be used much sooner, for a press officer to manage public communications, and for a smaller number of trained searchers rather than a large number of untrained volunteers." The report acknowledged what Dwight McCarter had been saying from the beginning, that the massive influx of well-meaning but uncoordinated searchers had very likely done more harm than good, contaminating the search area and potentially destroying the very evidence they were looking for. The disappearance of Dennis Martin did not just haunt one family. It changed the way that the National Park Service conducted search and rescue operations across the entire system. The lessons learned from the failures of June 1969 were incorporated into new protocols and training programs that are still in use today. Emergency Manager Liz Hall of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park would later describe it plainly. The Dennis Martin case changed everything. Prior to Dennis Martin, we were not familiar with really regimented search and rescue practices. We went out in the woods, did our best to look for him wherever we could, but didn't actually have a pragmatic and systematic way of addressing where he might be. That is the bitter legacy of this case, that it took losing a child to teach the people responsible for the park that they did not know how to look for one. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in cases like this. What happens to a child who is lost in the wilderness? Not the statistics or the survival rates, but the experience itself. What it feels like, what the mind does, what the body does. Because if Dennis Martin walked into those trees and became disoriented, as many people believe, then understanding what he would have experienced matters. It matters because it helps us think about where he might have gone and why he was never found. And it matters because he was a real child, not a case number. And the hours he spent alone in those mountains, however many there were hours of his life. When a young child becomes separated from adults in a wilderness setting, the first reaction is usually confusion rather than panic. A 6-year-old does not have the same cognitive map of the world that an adult does. Dennis would not have understood the concept of being lost in the way that an adult would. He would have known that he could not see his dad or his brother. He would have known that the trees looked different from where he was standing than they had a moment ago. But the word lost, with all its implications, would not have meant the same thing to him that it means to us. Children under 7 tend to do something that search and rescue professionals call random wandering. Unlike older children or adults who may try to retrace their steps or navigate by landmarks, young children often just keep moving, following whatever draws their attention. A stream, a gap in the trees where the walking is easier, a downhill slope because going down is easier than going up. They do not think in terms of direction or distance. They think in terms of what is immediately in front of them. This means that a lost 6-year-old can cover a surprising amount of ground in a very short time, but in unpredictable directions. Search models developed in the decades since Dennis disappeared suggest that a child of his age in this type of terrain could travel anywhere from a few hundred yards to several miles from the point where he was last seen, depending on the terrain, his physical condition, and how long he walked before stopping. There is another behavior that is common in lost children, and it is one that haunts every search and rescue professional who has ever worked a case involving a young child. It is called denning. When a lost child becomes tired, cold, or frightened, they will often seek out a small, enclosed space to hide in. A hollow log, a space beneath a fallen tree, a depression in the ground covered by rhododendron branches, a gap between boulders. The child crawls into this space and stays there, sometimes calling out, sometimes silent. They may fall asleep. If the weather is cold enough, they may never wake up. The problem with denning from a search perspective is that it makes the child almost impossible to find visually. A child curled up inside a hollow log 3 feet off the trail might as well be invisible. Searchers can walk within arm's reach of a denning child and never know they are there, especially if the child is not responding to calls, either because they are asleep, because they are too weak to shout, or because they are afraid. And that fear is real. It seems counterintuitive that a lost child would hide from the very people trying to find them. But small children often have a deep, instinctive fear of strangers, especially large groups of strangers making loud noises in the woods. If Dennis heard the searchers before he saw them, if he heard shouting and crashing through the brush and the thudding of helicopter rotors overhead, he may have done exactly the opposite of what everyone hoped he would do. He may have hidden more deeply instead of revealing himself. The storm that hit on the night Dennis disappeared would have compounded all of these factors. Rain saturates clothing, and wet clothing pulls heat from the body many times faster than dry clothing. A 6-year-old in a soaked red t-shirt and green shorts at nearly 5,000 feet of elevation, with temperatures dropping to near 50 degrees, would have been in serious physiological trouble within an hour or two. Shivering would have started first, then confusion as the body's core temperature dropped, then drowsiness, a dangerous and deceptive calm that would have felt to Dennis like an invitation to sleep. Hypothermia in small children is quick and it is quiet. It does not announce itself the way you might expect. There is no dramatic collapse, no cry for help. The child simply becomes still. The shivering stops. The eyes close. And if there is no one there to find them and warm them, they do not open again. If this is what happened to Dennis Martin, it likely happened on the first night, June 14th, 1969, while the rain poured down and the streams rose and the trails turned to rivers of mud. Somewhere in the darkness below Spence Field, a little boy in a red shirt may have crawled beneath a fallen tree or into a thicket of laurel and gone to sleep for the last time. And then the forest did what it does. The leaves fell, the moss grew, the fungi and the insects and the microorganisms that make up the invisible army of decomposition went to work. In the Smokies, where the humidity is high and the rainfall is abundant, a body in the forest is broken down with remarkable efficiency. Within weeks, the soft tissue would have been gone. consumed by insects and bacteria and the larger scavengers, the bears and the coyotes and the feral hogs that roam these mountains in abundance. Within months, the bones would have been scattered by animals across a wide area. Some of them carried hundreds of yards from the original site, and every year, an inch of leaf litter and organic debris would settle over whatever remained, slowly burying the last traces of Dennis Martin under a thickening blanket of the forest floor. By 1985, when the ginseng hunter reported finding skeletal remains near Big Hollow, any bones that had been on the surface 16 years earlier would have been beneath more than a foot of accumulated debris. By the time of the 50th anniversary of the disappearance in 2019, the depth would have been approaching 5 feet. Today, it would be more. The wilderness does not keep records. It does not preserve evidence. It absorbs everything that enters it and transforms it into something else, into soil and nutrients and new growth. The forest that Dennis walked into in 1969 is not the same forest that stands there today. It has renewed itself many times over, growing and falling and growing again, in an endless cycle that makes human timescales feel impossibly brief. This is why the honest answer to the question of what happened to Dennis Martin may also be the most difficult one to accept. He may be there, right there, in the mountains where he disappeared, within a mile or two of the spot where his father last saw him, buried beneath decades of leaf fall and decay, so thoroughly absorbed by the forest that no search, no matter how exhaustive, could find him. Or he may not be there at all. And that is the other possibility, the one that kept Bill Martin searching for 45 years. Now let's talk about the leads, because even though the search itself produced nothing, there were reports and sightings and claims that drifted in during those frantic weeks and in the years that followed. Some were credible enough to warrant investigation. Others were the desperate offerings of people who wanted to help but had nothing real to offer. And at least one lead, had it been pursued more aggressively at the time, might have changed the course of the investigation entirely. The first and most significant lead came from a man named Harold Key. Key was a state highway engineer from Tennessee who had been visiting Cades Cove with his family on the same weekend that Dennis disappeared. They were hoping to photograph a bear, one of the most popular reasons for visiting that part of the park. On the evening of Saturday, June 14th, the same day Dennis vanished, Key and his family were in an area near a stream called Sea Branch, also known as Rowan's Creek. According to Key, sometime around 6 or 7 in the evening, his family heard a scream. It was loud and piercing, and it sounded like it had come from a child. The sound was alarming enough that Key went to investigate. What he found, or rather, what he saw, was deeply unsettling. An unkempt man emerged from the woods, near where the scream had been heard. The figure was dirty and disheveled, with a wild, rough appearance. According to some versions of Key's account, the man appeared to be carrying something over his shoulder, something that looked like cloth or clothing, and it was red, the same color as the shirt Dennis Martin had been wearing. Other versions described the man as wearing dark gray work clothes and being generally suspicious in appearance. Key also reported finding a piece of paper on the ground near where the man had been hiding. The paper appeared to have a hand-drawn map on it. The strange man departed the area quickly, and some accounts mention that he drove away in a white Chevrolet. Harold Key reported what he had seen to the authorities. An FBI agent and a park ranger accompanied him back to the area to try to pinpoint exactly where the sighting had occurred. The location was determined to be somewhere near Sea Branch, approximately 5 to 7 miles from Spence Field. By trail, the distance was closer to 7 or 9 miles through extremely rugged terrain. And this is where the investigation of the key sighting fell apart. The FBI calculated that it would have taken approximately 3 hours to travel from Spence Field to the location of Key's sighting on foot. Dennis had disappeared around 4:30 in the afternoon. Key said he saw the man around 6 or 7 in the evening. That meant roughly 1.5 to 2.5 hours had elapsed between the disappearance and the sighting, depending on the exact times. The FBI concluded that this was not enough time for someone to have traveled that distance, especially through such difficult terrain, especially while carrying a child. Therefore, they determined that the Key sighting was unrelated to Dennis Martin's disappearance. The case file reflects this conclusion in matter-of-fact language. The sighting was too far away. The timeline didn't work. End of investigation. But not everyone agreed with this conclusion. Dwight McCarter, the park ranger who had been part of the search from the beginning, pointed out something that the FBI's analysis seemed to have overlooked. The direction from Spence Field to Sea Branch was predominantly downhill. A fit adult moving quickly through the forest, even while carrying a child, could cover significantly more ground downhill than the FBI's estimate suggested. McCarter argued that it was entirely plausible for someone with knowledge of the terrain to have made that journey in the available time. Let's think about this for a moment, because the distance question is actually more nuanced than the FBI made it seem. Their estimate of 3 hours was based on average travel speed through backcountry terrain. But the route from Spence Field to the lower elevations where Key reported his sighting followed natural corridors, stream drainages, and trail systems that allowed for faster movement than bushwhacking through dense undergrowth. The grade was predominantly downhill, which matters enormously when you are calculating travel time in the mountains. Descending is dramatically faster than ascending, sometimes 2 or 3 times as fast, especially for someone who is motivated and familiar with the terrain. McCarter, who had spent his entire career navigating these mountains, estimated that a fit adult could have covered the distance in considerably less than 3 hours, perhaps 90 minutes, perhaps 2 hours. The FBI's calculation may have been technically correct for an average hiker, but it did not account for the possibility that the person Key saw was anything but average. If this was someone who knew the Smokies, who had spent time in these forests, who knew the shortcuts and the stream beds and the game trails that don't appear on any map, the timeline becomes much less of an obstacle to the theory that the two events were connected. Then there is the question of timing. Key was uncertain about the exact time of his sighting. He estimated it at around 6 in the evening, but acknowledged that he was not sure. If the actual time was closer to 6:30 or 7, the window between Dennis's disappearance at 4:30 and the sighting expands to 2 or even 2.5 hours. That is more than enough time for the scenario McCarter described. And then there is the red material. Key described the man as carrying something over his shoulder that appeared to be cloth or clothing, and it was red. In most investigations, a witness reporting that a suspect was seen carrying clothing matching the description of a missing victim's clothing would trigger an intensive follow-up. The area would be sealed off. The man's description would be circulated to every law enforcement agency in the region. The vehicle he was driving would be traced through registration records. Every effort would be made to identify and locate this individual. Instead, the lead was noted in the file and effectively shelved. The FBI's position was that the sighting could not be connected to Dennis's disappearance because of the distance and timeline. Whether this was a sound investigative judgment or a failure to adequately pursue a critical lead is a question that people who study this case continue to debate more than 50 years later. Key himself was unclear on the exact time of his sighting, which weakened the precision of the timeline argument. If the sighting had occurred somewhat later than Key initially estimated, the window of time would have been even larger. And the detail about the red clothing over the figure's shoulder was deeply troubling, a coincidence that seemed almost too specific to dismiss. But dismissed it was. The FBI gave the Key report no real credence. And perhaps more troubling, they did not share the details of the sighting with Bill Martin, Dennis's father. When Bill eventually learned about it through other channels, he was furious. He believed with all his heart that his son had been kidnapped, and the Key sighting seemed to him like exactly the kind of lead that should have been pursued aggressively. There is a paper trail here that deserves attention. Key also reported finding a piece of paper near where the man had been, a paper that appeared to have a hand-drawn map on it. What was on that map? Where did it depict? Was it collected as evidence? These questions are not clearly answered in the available records. A hand-drawn map found near a suspicious individual in the vicinity of a missing child case seems like it should have been analyzed thoroughly. Whether it was or not is one of the many unknowns that surround this lead. Key himself later speculated that the man he saw might have been a moonshiner, which would explain the individual's rough appearance and his desire to avoid being seen. Moonshining was still a real, if declining, practice in the remote hollows of the Smokies in 1969, and an illegal distiller would have every reason to flee if he thought he'd been spotted near his operation. But this alternative explanation did not account for the red material over the man's shoulder, or for the scream that Key's family had heard. The Key sighting remains one of the most debated aspects of the Dennis Martin case to this day. Some researchers believe it was a genuine encounter with whoever took Dennis from Spence Field. Others believe it was an unrelated incident that has been inflated by decades of speculation. The truth, as with so much in this case, may never be known. But what can be said is that the lead deserved more than it received. At minimum, a more thorough investigation of the man's identity and the circumstances of the sighting would have either confirmed its relevance or definitively ruled it out. Instead, it was left in a kind of investigative limbo, neither pursued nor resolved, and it has haunted the case ever since. Beyond the Key sighting, there were other leads that came and went without resolution. The Martin family themselves flagged several things they found suspicious in the aftermath of the disappearance. One was an unnamed man from Dandridge, Tennessee, who had been camped at Spence Field when Dennis went missing. Dandridge is a small town in Jefferson County, about 50 miles east of Cades Cove. Bill Martin told park rangers that something about this man's behavior struck him as off, though the specific details of what concerned him have not been made entirely public. What exactly Bill observed whether the man said something unusual, behaved strangely, or was simply present in a way that later felt significant in hindsight, we do not know. But Bill felt strongly enough about it to bring it to the attention of investigators. The FBI reportedly looked into the Dandridge man. In the released files, the Bureau noted that they had discreetly established that this man had not been present in the park on the day of the disappearance. The word discreetly is notable. It suggests that the investigation was conducted quietly, perhaps through interviews with other people who had been in the area or through checking the man's alibi. How the FBI definitively established that someone was not in a vast, unmonitored national park on a specific day in 1969 is not entirely clear from the available records. Michael Bouchard, the author and researcher who fought for years to get the FBI files released, said he personally reached out to the individual identified in the reports. The outcome of that contact has not been made public. The Martins also raised an intriguing question that speaks to the particular circumstances of this case. Could someone have confused the two Martin families? Remember, there was another family named Martin at Spence Field that weekend, the family of a doctor with two young sons. This was a coincidence that the family kept returning to. Two families, same last name, same location, same weekend. If someone had been watching the area, if someone had targeted the Martin name for any reason, they might have approached the wrong group and taken the wrong child. Bill and his wife Violet wondered about this possibility and asked investigators to look into it. The FBI followed up on this theory, but found no evidence to support it. There is no public information suggesting that the other Martin family was ever threatened or targeted in any way, but the theory illustrates the desperate thoroughness with which the Martins tried to make sense of what had happened. They were grasping at every thread, no matter how thin, because any explanation was better than none. As the days turned into weeks and the search wound down, the phone calls started coming in. The Martin family had offered a $5,000 reward for information about Dennis, a substantial sum in 1969, equivalent to more than $40,000 today. The reward attracted all manner of responses. Psychics from across the country called in with visions and predictions. One psychic from Los Angeles said he had seen the boy 2.5 miles to the left of where he was last seen, alive but hung up in bushes after falling off a steep area. A psychic from New Orleans told authorities to stop looking on the ground and start looking up in the trees and treetops. In all, there were dozens of calls from psychics and self-described clairvoyants, and the search teams followed up on every single one. Every call led to a dead end. There's something deeply painful about this detail, about a family so desperate for any thread of hope that they listened to every psychic who called, and about search teams so committed that they actually went out and checked the locations these psychics described. It speaks to the totality of the void that Dennis's disappearance created. When there is no evidence, when there are no clues, when the mountain gives you absolutely nothing to work with, you will listen to anyone who claims to know something, because the alternative is silence, and silence is unbearable. The community response to Dennis's disappearance went beyond the searchers who walked the trails. Back in Knoxville, the story was front-page news for weeks. The Knoxville News Sentinel covered the search extensively, publishing updates daily, running photographs of the search teams and the helicopter flights and the anxious face of Bill Martin. Newspapers across Tennessee and the broader South picked up the story, It resonated in a way that went beyond the usual missing child case, partly because of the setting, partly because of the circumstances, and partly because of the utter bafflement that the search produced. People could understand a kidnapping from a parking lot. They could understand a drowning in a river. What they could not understand was how a child could simply cease to exist in the middle of a mountain meadow while surrounded by his own family. The churches in Knoxville and the surrounding communities held vigils and prayer services. Neighbors brought food to the Martin home on Murray Road. Dennis's schoolmates, the children he had just finished kindergarten with, were told in careful, gentle terms that their classmate was missing and that people were looking for him. Some of them were too young to understand what that meant. Others understood all too well. Violet Martin, Dennis's mother, waited at home. The Father's Day camping tradition was for the men and boys, and so she had stayed behind with the other children. She had said goodbye to her husband and her 2 sons, and her father-in-law on Friday morning, expecting them back on Sunday evening. Instead, she received a phone call that would rearrange every molecule of her existence. Her youngest child was gone, somewhere in the mountains, and nobody could find him. We do not know much about Violet's experience during those weeks. The family has maintained their privacy with a firmness that is both understandable and heartbreaking. But we can imagine, if we allow ourselves the particular agony of waiting, of being unable to join the search because someone had to stay home with the other children, of watching the news reports each night and hearing that another day had passed with no trace found, of going to bed and wondering whether her son was alive somewhere in the darkness, cold and frightened and calling for her. It is important to hold this part of the story gently. The Martin family did not choose to become a public tragedy. They went on a camping trip. They followed a tradition that had been part of their family for decades. They did nothing wrong, nothing negligent, nothing careless, and yet their lives were shattered in a way that would never be fully repaired. When the 2-week mark passed with no sign of Dennis, the FBI formally stepped in to evaluate whether the disappearance might be a kidnapping. FBI Special Agent Jim Ride was assigned to lead the investigation into the Martin family's background. The purpose was straightforward. Before the Bureau could treat this as a potential abduction, they needed to determine whether anyone connected to the family might have had a motive to harm Dennis or to stage his disappearance. The investigation was thorough. Agents looked into the Martin family's personal and financial circumstances, their relationships, their history. They interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, and associates. The conclusion was clear and unequivocal. The Martins had no enemies. No one in their circle appeared suspicious. There was no motive, no grudge, no financial reason for anyone to target their family. Bill and Violet Martin were exactly what they appeared to be: ordinary, loving parents who had lost their child in the worst possible way. But even as the FBI cleared the family's inner circle, Agent Ride and his colleagues maintained a frustrating position that would define their involvement in the case from beginning to end. Without clear evidence that a crime had been committed, they said, the FBI had no jurisdiction. There was no body. There was no crime scene, or at least none that could be identified as such. There was no ransom demand, no threatening letters, no witnesses who had seen anyone physically take the child. Under the legal framework of the time, the FBI's hands were effectively tied. They could observe and advise, but they could not take over the investigation or commit the full weight of their resources to solving it. This meant that the FBI operated more as observers than investigators, a distinction that would cause Bill Martin enormous frustration for the rest of his life. He wanted the FBI to take charge, to bring their forensic expertise and their nationwide network of agents to bear on the search for his son. Instead, they sat in meetings, reviewed reports, and told him that without evidence of a crime, there was nothing more they could do. The FBI's case file on Dennis Martin eventually grew to 133 pages. For decades, the Bureau refused to release these files to the public. Freedom of Information Act requests were filed by journalists, researchers, and members of law enforcement who wanted to know what the FBI had found. Request after request was denied. The files were classified or redacted or simply unavailable. It was an investigator and author named Michael Bouchard who finally broke through. Bouchard had written a book about the case titled The Disappearance of Dennis Lloyd Martin, Lost in the Great Smoky Mountains. He had filed FOIA requests with the FBI 3 times and been denied 3 times, but he persisted, and in late 2022, the FBI finally released the files through their online vault. So what did those 133 pages reveal? Some of the information confirmed what was already publicly known: the FBI's assessment that there was no evidence of a kidnapping, the family background investigation that cleared the Martins of any involvement, the conclusion that Chief Park Ranger Lee Snedden's theory that Dennis had wandered off, become lost, and died of exposure was the most plausible explanation. The files also included details about the Harold Key sighting. They confirmed that Key had accompanied a ranger and an FBI agent to the location of his sighting, and that the spot had been determined to be approximately 7 miles from Spence Field by trail. The FBI had calculated the travel time and concluded it was too far. The files showed that Key was unsure of the exact time of his sighting, estimating it at around 6 in the evening. This uncertainty further weakened the connection to Dennis's disappearance in the FBI's view. The files revealed something else about the FBI's view of the Martin family. Agents noted that Bill Martin's mental health had been severely affected by the loss of his son. This is hardly surprising, but the way it was framed in the files was significant. The agents felt that Bill's deteriorating mental state made him vulnerable to the claims of psychics and to stories about feral people living in the park, claims that the FBI adamantly refused to look into. There's something uncomfortable about this characterization. A father whose child has vanished without a trace is described as mentally compromised because he is willing to consider theories that the authorities have dismissed. Whether this assessment was compassionate or condescending depends, perhaps, on where you stand. But the most unexpected revelation in the FBI files came from a lead that had been generated nearly a decade after Dennis disappeared, and that the public knew nothing about until the files were released. On November 16, 1978, FBI agents interviewed a confidential informant. This person told them a shocking story. He claimed that a previous cellmate had admitted to him that he had kidnapped a boy named Dennis Martin from the Great Smoky Mountains. Not only that, but the cellmate had said that he then sold the boy to another man. Let that information settle for a moment. 9 years after Dennis disappeared, a person sitting in a prison or a jail somewhere told federal agents that a man he had been locked up with confessed to taking Dennis Martin, not just taking him, but trafficking him, selling a child to another person. The agents who conducted this interview were apparently unfamiliar with the Dennis Martin case. This is not unusual. FBI agents are assigned to cases and transferred between offices regularly, and a 9-year-old missing child case from a national park in Tennessee would not necessarily be on the radar of agents working in other jurisdictions or on other types of crime. But when they looked into it, they found that the details provided by the informant were a plausible match for what was known about the disappearance. The location, the name, the circumstances, all lined up closely enough to warrant further investigation. They took the claim seriously enough to begin trying to locate the alleged kidnapper, working with only a last name to go on. What followed was a slow, methodical effort to find one man in a country of more than 200 million people, using the resources available to the FBI in the late 1970s. No internet, no digital databases, just paper records, phone calls, and legwork. Over the following months and into 1979 and 1980, the FBI managed to identify an individual they believed to be the same person the informant had described. They obtained a photograph and showed it to the informant, who confirmed that this was indeed his former cellmate. The identification was positive. This was the man who had allegedly confessed. In 1980, 11 years after Dennis's disappearance, agents tracked the man down and interviewed him directly. They asked him if he had any knowledge of Dennis Martin's disappearance and whether he had kidnapped the boy. He denied it, flatly and completely. He claimed that the informant had fabricated the story because the two men disliked each other and the informant was trying to cause him trouble. It was a jailhouse grudge, he said, and the confession had been invented out of spite. The informant, for his part, offered to take a polygraph examination to prove he was telling the truth. A polygraph, while not admissible in court and not considered scientifically reliable, is often used by law enforcement as an investigative tool to assess the credibility of witnesses and informants. The informant's willingness to submit to one suggested a degree of confidence in his own account. But it is unclear from the released files whether the FBI ever administered the test. The documents simply do not address the question, which is itself a source of frustration for researchers who have reviewed the files. With nothing to corroborate the informant's story and no physical evidence linking the suspect to the Smokies or to Dennis, the agents felt they could go no further. There was no forensic evidence. There were no additional witnesses. There was no way to prove or disprove the claim through investigation alone. The lead went cold. This is perhaps the single most tantalizing and maddening detail in the entire case file. A specific named allegation of a specific crime against a specific victim made by a person willing to take a polygraph, identifying a specific individual as the perpetrator, and then nothing. The lead simply expired, unresolved, unpursued to any definitive conclusion. Not proven, not disproven, just abandoned. Whether this represents a reasonable conclusion by investigators working with limited resources and insufficient evidence, or whether it represents a failure of the system to follow through on a genuine lead in the kidnapping of a child, depends on your perspective. The FBI would argue, with some justification, that jailhouse informants are among the most unreliable sources in law enforcement, that inmates frequently fabricate stories about other inmates for personal reasons, and that the absence of corroborating evidence made it impossible to proceed. Critics would counter that the stakes of the case, the life of a missing child, warranted a more aggressive pursuit, including the administration of the polygraph, a deeper investigation of the suspect's movements in June 1969, and a more thorough effort to determine whether any evidence existed that could either confirm or rule out his involvement. We will probably never know which perspective is correct. The suspect's name remains redacted in the released files. His current status, whether he is alive or dead, whether he has ever been connected to any other crimes, is unknown to the public. The informant's fate is similarly unknown. The entire episode exists in the files as a detour, a brief flare of possibility that illuminated nothing before going dark. The other details revealed by the 2022 file release filled in gaps but did not solve the puzzle. This is one of those details that lands differently depending on what you believe happened to Dennis Martin. If you believe the boy died of exposure in the woods, then the jailhouse confession is exactly what the suspect said it was, a fabrication by someone with a grudge. People in prison make false claims about other inmates all the time. It is one of the most unreliable forms of information in law enforcement. But if you are inclined to believe that Dennis was taken from Spence Field by another person, then this lead is haunting. Here was a specific claim, naming a specific victim, describing a specific crime, made by someone who identified a specific individual as the perpetrator. The informant was willing to submit to a polygraph. The suspect was identified and located, and then nothing happened. The lead just quietly expired in the files, unresolved, unproven, unforgotten. The other figure who hung in the margins of the investigation for years was the suspicious man from Dandridge, Tennessee, who had been at Spence Field on the day Dennis vanished. Michael Bouchard, the author and investigator, said that he reached out directly to the man identified in the reports as the suspicious individual. The FBI files revealed that agents had discreetly established that this man had not been present in the park on the day of the disappearance. How they established this is not entirely clear, but the theory was laid to rest in the official record. The problem with the Dennis Martin case has never been a lack of theories. It has been a lack of evidence. Every theory, whether it involves exposure, animal attack, abduction, or something else entirely, runs up against the same implacable wall. Nothing was ever found. And in the absence of physical evidence, any theory is as defensible and as indefensible as any other. So let us walk through the theories, one by one, with the care and the honesty they deserve. The first and most widely accepted theory is that Dennis Martin wandered away from Spence Field, became disoriented in the dense forest, and died of exposure on the night of June 14th, or in the days that followed. This is the theory favored by most park officials and by many researchers who have studied the case. It is, in some ways, the simplest explanation, and in missing persons cases, the simplest explanation is very often the correct one. The reasoning is straightforward. Dennis was 6 years old. He stepped into the woods at the edge of the meadow, perhaps intending to circle around to his hiding spot for the prank, and took a wrong turn. The forest around Spence Field is thick and disorienting, especially for a small child. The terrain drops away steeply on both sides of the ridge. It would not take long for a boy walking in the wrong direction to find himself in a ravine or a hollow where the vegetation was so dense that he could not see the meadow he had just left. A 6-year-old in that situation would likely become frightened. He might have called for help, but if he was in a ravine or on the opposite side of a ridge from the adults, his voice might not have carried far enough to be heard. He might have tried to find his way back and only gotten further from the field. Children who are lost in the wilderness often do not behave the way adults expect them to. They may hide from searchers, especially if they are frightened or believe they are in trouble. They may move much farther than expected, driven by panic or by the instinct to keep walking in search of something familiar. When the thunderstorm hit that evening, Dennis would have been soaked through within minutes. At nearly 5,000 feet of elevation, the temperature dropped to near 50 degrees. In a wet t-shirt and shorts, hypothermia would have set in rapidly. Dwight McCarter, who knew these mountains as well as anyone, was blunt about what this meant. To be a child caught out in that kind of storm, in those kinds of temperatures without shelter, it is not a good thing. Their system is not built like adults. Hypothermia sets in quick. If Dennis died of exposure on that first night or within the following day or two, the question becomes why his body was never found. The answer to this is less comforting than the question. The terrain around Spence Field is vast and complex. The ravines are deep and choked with vegetation. A small body could come to rest in a depression or beneath a fallen tree or in a thicket of rhododendron and be virtually invisible to someone passing just a few feet away. And the massive search itself may have contributed to the problem. With over 1,000 people trampling through the area, subtle signs that a tracker might have noticed, a disturbed patch of leaves, a broken branch, a faint imprint in the soil, were obliterated. Over time, the natural processes of decomposition would have reduced Dennis's remains to bare bones, and the animals of the forest, the bears and the coyotes and the feral hogs and the smaller scavengers, would have scattered those bones across a wide area. McCarter, in his later writings, pointed out that for every year that remains lay in the park, the Great Smoky Mountain Woods layers up 1 inch of debris. Fallen leaves, decaying vegetation, moss and soil slowly bury everything. After more than 50 years, any traces of Dennis would be beneath several feet of accumulated organic material. Finding them would require a level of luck that borders on the miraculous. The superintendent's letter from September 1969 expressed the belief that if Dennis were ever found, he would be found within a few miles of the shelter near where he disappeared. This is consistent with the lost in the woods theory and with what we know about how children behave when they become lost. They tend to travel downhill, following the path of least resistance, often following streams or drainages. If Dennis walked downhill from Spence Field into one of the deep hollows that radiate out from the ridgeline, he might have covered a mile or two before hypothermia and exhaustion stopped him. The exposure theory is the most probable explanation, but it is not without its own troubling questions. Dennis was wearing a bright red shirt. The search involved more than 1,000 people over nearly 2 weeks, covering 56 square miles. Helicopters flew overhead. Professional trackers walked the trails and the stream beds, and they found nothing. Not a scrap of red fabric caught on a branch, not a shoe half buried in the mud. Nothing. The park superintendent himself acknowledged the strangeness of this. Nothing at all had been found, the case file reads, with an almost bewildered simplicity. Imagine, for a moment, that you are one of the searchers. It is day 5 of the search, a Wednesday in June, and you have been walking through the mountains since dawn. The forest around you is thick and green and alive with birdsong. The ground is steep and uneven, covered in a layer of decaying leaves that are slick from the rain earlier in the week. You are moving through a rhododendron thicket. the branches so dense overhead that they block most of the sunlight, creating a kind of green twilight even at noon. You have to bend almost double to get through some passages, pushing branches aside with your forearms, stepping carefully over roots and rocks that you cannot see beneath the leaf litter. You are looking for a 6-year-old boy. You know what he was wearing, a red t-shirt and green shorts. You know his name. Dennis. You've been calling it for hours, your voice hoarse, your throat raw. Every few minutes you stop and listen, straining to hear anything that might be a child's voice, anything that might be a rustle of movement that doesn't belong to the wind or the birds or the dozens of other searchers spread out through the forest around you. The ravine you are searching drops away sharply to your left. Below, maybe 50 feet down, a stream rushes over rocks, swollen from the rain. The slope is covered in loose stone and rotting logs and tangles of vegetation that could conceal almost anything. You can see maybe 10 feet in any direction. Beyond that, the forest swallows everything. Could a small boy be lying in this ravine right now, just below where you are standing, hidden by a fallen tree or a thicket of laurel? Yes, absolutely. Could you walk right past him without seeing him? Yes, even in a red shirt, even in a forest of green, the dense vegetation of the Smokies can hide a child-sized form with terrifying ease. A small body lying still in a depression or beneath a log, covered by even a thin layer of leaves, would be nearly invisible from just a few yards away. And this is the cruel arithmetic of the search. More than 1,000 people covered 56 square miles. That sounds like an enormous effort, and it was. But 56 square miles is roughly 36,000 acres. Divide that by the 1,400 searchers at the peak of the operation, and each person is responsible for about 25 acres. 25 acres of some of the most rugged, densely vegetated terrain in the eastern United States. 25 acres of ravines and thickets and fallen timber and boulder fields and stream beds. It is simply not possible for one person to thoroughly search 25 acres of this kind of terrain in a day or even in a week. Significant portions of the search area were covered only superficially, with searchers walking trails and ridge lines and stream banks without penetrating the dense interior of the forest between them. Dwight McCarter understood this better than most. He spent his career in these mountains, learning what to look for and how to look for it, and he always maintained that the answer was not more searchers, but better searchers. A handful of skilled trackers, given time and space to work without interference, could have accomplished more than 1,000 untrained volunteers trampling through the same ground day after day. But in the chaos of those first few days, when the urgency was overwhelming and the hope of finding Dennis alive was still strong, nobody was willing to hold back the tide of people who wanted to help. The result was a search that was both massive and insufficient. Massive in its scale and its cost and its emotional toll. Insufficient in its ability to actually find a small boy in a vast wilderness. It is one of the painful ironies of the Dennis Martin case that the very thing that made the search unprecedented, the sheer number of people who participated, may also be the reason it failed. The second theory is that Dennis was killed by a wild animal. The area around Spence Field is home to black bears, feral hogs, bobcats, and copperhead snakes. A bear encounter is the most commonly suggested scenario, though a confrontation with feral hogs, which can be aggressive and unpredictable, has also been proposed. Wildlife experts have generally been skeptical of this theory. a bear large enough to kill and carry off a child would almost certainly have left some sign of the encounter: torn clothing, blood, drag marks, disturbed vegetation. Bears in the Smokies were not known to be unusually aggressive toward humans in 1969. They are predominantly black bears, which are generally less aggressive than grizzlies and tend to avoid confrontation. While any large wild animal can be dangerous, especially if surprised or defending cubs, the scenario of a bear attacking, killing, and completely consuming a 6-year-old boy without leaving any trace at all stretches the boundaries of what wildlife biologists consider likely. Feral hogs are another possibility. They can be aggressive, especially in groups, and they are efficient at consuming and scattering remains. But again, the complete absence of any evidence, no torn clothing, no blood stain, no sign of a struggle, makes this theory difficult to support with anything more than speculation. The third theory is that Dennis was abducted. This is the theory that his father, Bill Martin, believed for the rest of his life. It is also the theory that generates the most debate and the most emotional responses among people who have studied the case. The evidence for abduction is largely circumstantial. The Harold Key sighting, if taken at face value, describes a disheveled man in the woods carrying what appeared to be red clothing over his shoulder, roughly an hour after Dennis vanished, at a location that was difficult but not impossible to reach from Spence Field in the available time. The 1978 jailhouse claim, in which a confidential informant said his former cellmate confessed to kidnapping Dennis and selling him to another man, adds another layer of unease to the theory, even though the accused denied it and no physical evidence was ever found. There is also the broader context to consider. The late 1960s were a time of social upheaval in America, and the backcountry of the southern Appalachians had a share of people living on the margins. Remote cabins and camps existed in the more isolated parts of the Smokies, occupied by individuals who had, for various reasons, chosen to live off the grid. Moonshiners, hermits, and people evading the law all had a presence in the mountains. The idea that someone with predatory intentions might have been lurking near a popular camping spot on a busy weekend is unsettling, but not beyond the realm of possibility. Against the abduction theory, however, stands the absence of any physical evidence of a crime, and the FBI's consistent conclusion that there was nothing to suggest Dennis was taken by another person. The Key sighting was dismissed by investigators. The Dandridge man was investigated and cleared. The jailhouse informant story was ultimately uncorroborated. The family background check revealed no enemies or threats. Every thread that pointed toward abduction, when pulled, came loose in the investigators' hands. And there are the fringe theories, the ones that populate internet forums and true crime message boards, and that deserve mention only because they are part of the cultural landscape surrounding this case. Some people have speculated that Dennis was taken by feral humans, isolated communities of people supposedly living undetected in the deep wilderness of the Smokies. Dwight McCarter addressed this idea directly, noting that while there was one individual known to live off the grid in a remote cabin in the park, he was hardly feral and lived many miles from Spence Field. The notion of hidden communities of wild humans in the Smokies is, as author Michael Bouchard put it plainly, very, very far-fetched. Other theories venture into the supernatural. These do not warrant serious analysis, but they do illustrate the human need to explain the unexplainable. when a child vanishes without a trace in a place of vast natural beauty, and when every rational avenue of investigation produces nothing, the mind reaches for the irrational. This is not a failing. It is a measure of how profoundly disturbing the disappearance of Dennis Martin truly is. What is worth noting is that none of these more outlandish theories, the claims about mysterious creatures or paranormal events, have ever been endorsed by the Martin family, by park officials, or by any credible investigator. They exist in the margins of the case, in internet forums and late-night podcasts, and they tend to obscure the more important and more painful reality, which is that a real child disappeared, and that the real explanations, whether they involve exposure or abduction, are devastating enough without embellishment. There is one more thing worth saying about the theories before we move on. The debate between the exposure theory and the abduction theory is not merely academic. It carries emotional weight that is difficult for outsiders to fully appreciate. For Bill Martin, clinging to the abduction theory was not an act of denial. It was an act of hope. If Dennis had been taken, there was a possibility, however small, that he was alive, that someone had raised him, that he might one day be found. The exposure theory offered no such comfort. It said that his son had died alone and afraid in the cold rain on a June night, and that the mountains had consumed every trace of him. For a father, embracing that theory meant accepting something that is almost too large to hold. Different people who have studied this case have landed in different places, and that is as it should be. The honest truth is that the evidence does not definitively support any single explanation. It is entirely possible that we are asking the wrong question when we ask what happened. Maybe the more useful question is what kind of place is this and what is it capable of? The Great Smoky Mountains are not a city park. They are not a suburban backyard. They are 500,000 acres of some of the most rugged, dense, biologically active wilderness east of the Mississippi River. They are a place where things disappear, where trees fall and are consumed by the forest floor within a decade, where deer die and their bones are scattered and buried within a season, where the sheer volume of life and death and renewal happening every day on every square foot of ground makes the preservation of any single fragile thing over time nearly impossible. Dennis Martin disappeared into that wilderness, and the wilderness did what it has always done. It continued, without explanation, without apology, without giving back what it took. Dennis Martin was not the first person to vanish in the Great Smoky Mountains, and he would not be the last. The park's history is dotted with cases of people who walked into the forest and never returned. Some were hikers who strayed off trail and were found days or weeks later, dead from exposure or falls. Others, like Dennis, simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions. The Smokies have a particular talent for this kind of disappearance, a way of absorbing people into their vastness so completely that the usual mechanisms of discovery, a search party, a helicopter, a tracking dog, simply fail. In 1976, just 7 years after Dennis disappeared, a 16-year-old girl named Trenny Lynn Gibson vanished during a high school field trip in the park. She was a student at Bearden High School in Knoxville, the same city where the Martin family lived, and she had gone on a class trip to the Clingman's Dome area, the highest point in the park at 6,643 feet. Somewhere on the trail between Andrews Bald and the Clingman's Dome parking area, Trenny became separated from her group. Despite an extensive search of the area, she was never found. Not a trace, not a shoe, not a thread of clothing. The circumstances of her disappearance are eerily familiar. A group setting, a well-known trail in a popular area, a moment of separation that no one noticed until it was too late. And then, nothing. The mountains simply took her, as they had taken Dennis 7 years earlier. Trenny Lynn Gibson's case remains open to this day, another name on a list that no one wants to add to. There are other names, other people who went missing in the Smokies and were never found, or were found only after many years. The cases span decades, and each one carries its own weight of grief and unanswered questions. What they share, beyond the obvious, is the way they illuminate the relationship between humans and wilderness. We go to places like the Smokies because they are beautiful and wild and untamed. We seek out the very qualities, the vastness, the isolation, the sense of being in a place that is larger and older and more powerful than ourselves, that also make these places dangerous. The beauty and the danger are not separate things. They are two faces of the same mountain. The National Park Service has never stopped trying to learn from these cases. The protocols developed in the aftermath of Dennis Martin's disappearance were the beginning of a transformation in how search and rescue operations are conducted, not just in the Smokies but across the entire national park system and eventually across the country. Before 1969, search and rescue in the national parks was largely ad hoc. When someone went missing, rangers did their best with the resources and personnel available, but there was no standardized training, no established incident command structure, no systematic approach to determining where a missing person was most likely to be found. The search for Dennis Martin was a masterclass in everything that could go wrong. Too many searchers deployed too quickly with too little coordination. The scene contaminated by the very people trying to help. Evidence overlooked or dismissed. Critical decisions made without adequate information or expertise. The after-action review that the park conducted in October 1969 was, in many ways, the founding document of modern wilderness search and rescue. It laid out, in painful detail, what had gone wrong and what needed to change. The key lessons were deceptively simple. Smaller teams of trained searchers are more effective than large groups of untrained volunteers. Search dogs should be deployed as early as possible, before the scene is contaminated. A clear command structure must be established from the first hour. Evidence should be treated with the same care as in a criminal investigation. And the emotional pressure to do something, to flood the area with bodies and noise and activity, must be resisted in favor of a more measured, strategic approach. These lessons were incorporated into new training programs and protocols that spread through the National Park Service in the 1970s and 1980s. The concept of probability of detection, or POD, was developed and refined, providing a mathematical framework for determining how thoroughly a given area had actually been searched and how likely it was that a person in that area would have been found. The Incident Command System, or ICS, was adopted to provide clear chains of authority and communication during search operations. Search dog teams became an integral part of the response, trained to work in wilderness conditions and deployed early rather than as a last resort. By the time the next major disappearance occurred in the Smokies, the response looked dramatically different from what had happened in 1969. Smaller teams, better coordination, faster deployment of specialized resources. The lessons of the Dennis Martin search had been absorbed into the institutional DNA of the park, and they saved lives. Not Dennis's life. His was the one that was lost, but the lives of people who came after him, who got lost or injured in the same mountains, and who were found because the searchers had learned from the failures of June 1969. Liz Hall, the emergency manager for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, has spoken about this legacy with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The Dennis Martin case changed everything, she said. Prior to Dennis Martin, we were not familiar with really regimented search and rescue practices. We went out in the woods, did our best to look for him wherever we could, but did not actually have a pragmatic and systematic way of addressing where he might be. Every search that the park conducts today is, in a sense, a continuation of the search for Dennis Martin. Every protocol followed, every dog deployed, every probability model run carries within it the memory of a failure that could not be undone, but could, at least, be learned from. The rangers who conduct these searches know the story. The newer ones learn it during training. It is part of the institutional memory of the park, a cautionary tale, and a source of determination in equal measure. Whether Dennis Martin would have been found if the search had been conducted differently is a question that has no definitive answer. Dwight McCarter believed the answer was yes. He believed that a small team of experienced trackers, given first access to the scene before the massive influx of volunteers, could have followed the trail that Dennis left and found him within the first day or two. Whether he would have been found alive is another question entirely, one that depends on when hypothermia set in and how far Dennis traveled before he stopped moving. But McCarter's belief was not just wishful thinking. It was based on decades of experience in these exact mountains, searching for hundreds of lost people and finding most of them. He knew what the forest could hide and what a trained eye could reveal, and he always felt, with a quiet anguish that never fully faded, that Dennis Martin could have been found, that the opportunity was there in those first critical hours, and that it was squandered by well-meaning chaos. This is perhaps the most painful dimension of the Dennis Martin case. Not just that a child was lost, but that he might have been saved, that the tools and the knowledge to find him existed, or could have existed, but were not applied in time. It is a failure not of intention, but of capability, and it is the kind of failure that haunts the people who were involved in it for the rest of their lives. The years passed. The seasons turned in the Smokies, winter snow blanketing the ridges and spring wildflowers returning to the meadows, and the case of Dennis Martin settled into the category of the unresolved. But it never fully went away. In the early 1970s, just a few years after Dennis's disappearance, a man who had been illegally harvesting ginseng in the park made a discovery. While moving through a remote area called Big Hollow near Tremont, he came across skeletal remains that appeared to belong to a small child. The skull and bones were scattered, consistent with what would be expected after years of exposure and animal activity. Big Hollow is a deep, secluded drainage on the Tennessee side of the park, below the main ridgeline where Spence Field sits. The name tells you something about the terrain. Hollow, in Appalachian dialect, refers to a narrow valley between ridges, usually with a stream running through the bottom and steep, forested slopes on either side. Big Hollow is not a place where casual hikers go. It is off the main trails, accessible only by bushwhacking through dense forest or by following the stream bed upstream from the Tremont area. It is exactly the kind of place where something could lie undiscovered for years or decades. The ginseng hunter who found the remains was engaged in an activity with a long and complicated history in the Appalachian Mountains. Wild American ginseng, prized for its medicinal properties and commanding high prices in Asian markets, grows naturally in the rich, shaded soils of the Smoky Mountains. Harvesting it from the national park was and is illegal, but that has never stopped the practice entirely. Ginseng hunters know the remote areas of the park intimately. They move quietly and they move alone, and they do not advertise where they have been or what they have found. This particular hunter found the bones of what appeared to be a child in a place where no child should have been. He saw the skull, he saw the scattered remains, and he kept walking. He did not report his discovery to anyone. His reasoning was straightforward and, in its way, understandable, though it is difficult to forgive. He had been harvesting ginseng illegally. If he came forward about the bones, he would have to explain why he was in Big Hollow in the first place, and that explanation would lead directly to criminal charges. So he chose his own legal safety over the possibility that he had found the remains of a missing child whose family was still waiting for answers. The ginseng hunter kept this secret for more than a decade. It was not until 1985, approximately 16 years after Dennis had vanished, that he finally told someone. The person he told was Dwight McCarter, the retired park ranger who had been part of the original search and who had devoted much of his professional life to search and rescue in the Smokies. Why the hunter chose that particular moment to come forward after so many years of silence is not recorded. Perhaps guilt finally outweighed fear. Perhaps he read something about the case or heard someone mention it and felt the weight of what he knew become unbearable. Whatever his reason, he contacted McCarter and told him what he had found years earlier. McCarter took the report seriously. He assembled a team of about 30 experienced searchers, people who knew the backcountry and knew what to look for, and led them into Big Hollow to search for the remains. They found nothing. 16 years of leaf fall and decomposition and the slow, relentless work of the forest floor had done their work. The bones, if they had been Dennis's, were gone, buried under more than a foot of accumulated organic debris, or scattered by animals far beyond the area the searchers could cover, or simply dissolved back into the soil by the acids and the moisture and the biological processes that break down bone over time. McCarter and his team searched systematically, turning over logs and sifting through leaf litter, but the forest had reclaimed whatever had been there, and it was not giving it back. The location of the ginseng hunter's discovery was significant, however. Big Hollow was roughly 3 miles from Spence Field, and not far from the area along the west prong of the Little Pigeon River, where the child-sized footprints, one bare and one with an Oxford shoe, had been found during the 1969 search. If Dennis had walked downhill from the ridgeline, following a drainage as lost children often do, Big Hollow was a plausible direction for him to have traveled. And if the footprints that were dismissed by park officials had in fact been Dennis's, then the trajectory from the footprints to Big Hollow was consistent with a child continuing to move downhill after crossing that stream. McCarter saw this connection, and it haunted him. 2 pieces of evidence, the footprints and the bones, each dismissed or unconfirmed on its own, pointed in the same direction. Together, they suggested a narrative. Dennis walked downhill from Spence Field, lost a shoe crossing a stream, continued moving through the drainage, and came to rest somewhere in Big Hollow. If that was what happened, then the original search had missed him. The clues that might have led to Dennis had been ignored, and by the time the bones were reported, it was far too late to recover them. But without the remains themselves, there was nothing to confirm or deny that they had been Dennis's. The lead, like so many others in this case, dissolved into uncertainty. We will never know whose bones the ginseng hunter found. They might have been Dennis Martin's. They might have been the remains of an animal, misidentified by a man who was not a forensic expert. They might have been the bones of another person entirely, someone else whose story has been lost to the forest and to time. Bill Martin never stopped believing that his son had been kidnapped. He never stopped hoping that Dennis was alive somewhere, taken by a stranger and raised under another name in another place. This is the theory that offered him the most comfort, because it was the only theory that did not require Dennis to be dead. If Dennis had been abducted, there was at least the possibility, however remote, that he had survived, that he was out there, somewhere in America, living a life that Bill could not see, but that was nonetheless a life. This hope sustained Bill Martin through decades of silence and disappointment. It sustained him through the FBI's refusal to investigate more aggressively. It sustained him through the false leads and the psychic claims and the ginseng hunter's story and all the other dead ends that the case produced. Every morning, Bill Martin woke up in a world where his youngest son was missing, and every morning he chose to believe that Dennis was alive. That is the kind of faith that only a parent can sustain, and even then, the cost of sustaining it must have been enormous. Bill continued to press the FBI for answers for years. He wrote letters, he made phone calls, he pleaded with agents and officials and anyone else who might have the authority to reopen the investigation or to devote new resources to the case. He asked about the Harold Key sighting, about the Dandridge man, about every lead that had ever surfaced. The Bureau's response was always the same. Without evidence of a crime, there was nothing more they could do. There is a letter in the case files mentioned by Todd Matthews of the National Missing and Unidentified Person System that one of the Martin family members wrote to President Richard Nixon. Think about that for a moment. A family in Knoxville, Tennessee, writing to the President of the United States because they could not get anyone else to listen. The letter, the fact of its existence, tells you everything about the desperation and the determination that defined Bill Martin's response to the loss of his son. As the years passed, the case faded from the headlines, but not from the consciousness of the people who had been involved in it. The rangers who had searched for Dennis, the volunteers who had walked the ridges, the FBI agents who had reviewed the leads, all of them carried the memory of the case with them. Dwight McCarter wrote about it extensively. Other park personnel referenced it in training materials and in conversations with new rangers. Dennis Martin became a kind of institutional ghost, present in the background of every search operation the park conducted from that day forward. The broader community of missing persons advocates also kept the case alive. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created age-progressed images of Dennis, computer-generated portraits that attempted to show what he might look like as an adult. These images, haunting in their speculative nature, were based on photographs of Dennis as a 6-year-old and on facial characteristics of his family members. They showed a man in his 40s or 50s with dark hair and strong features, looking out from the image with an expression that is impossible to read because it is impossible to know whether this person ever existed. The age progressions were distributed to law enforcement agencies and posted on missing persons databases. They represented an acknowledgement that the abduction theory, while unproven, could not be ruled out, and that if Dennis had been taken and raised elsewhere, he might still be alive. He would be 63 years old in 2026. He might have a family of his own. He might have no memory of his life before the age of 6. He might not know his real name. Or he might have died on a mountainside in June 1969, 6 days before his 7th birthday. And the age progressions are images of someone who never was. We simply do not know. Bill Martin died in 2014, 45 years after Dennis disappeared. He was 80 years old. He had spent more than half his life searching for his son, and he died without finding him. He went to his grave without answers, without closure, without the one thing he wanted more than anything else in the world, which was to know. The rest of the Martin family has been silent about the case since the search ended. Violet Martin, Dennis's mother, and his siblings Douglas, Michael, and Sarah have not spoken publicly about Dennis or about their experience. Whatever grief they carry privately. This silence is their right, and it should be respected absolutely. They did not ask to become a public story. They did not ask for the attention or the theories or the internet speculation. They lost a child and a brother, and they have chosen to grieve in their own way, on their own terms. There is a particular cruelty in the way that unsolved cases are consumed by the public. The mystery becomes the thing that people are interested in, and the people at the center of the mystery, the ones who are actually suffering, become secondary to the puzzle. Dennis Martin is discussed on Reddit threads and true crime podcasts and YouTube channels, and in all of those discussions, the focus is usually on the theories, on whether it was exposure or abduction, on the key sighting and the Green Berets and the ginseng hunter's bones. The family's grief, which is the most real and most important part of the story, is acknowledged briefly and then set aside in favor of the more intellectually stimulating question of what happened. We should resist that temptation, or at least be aware of it. The question of what happened to Dennis Martin matters because Dennis was a person, not because the mystery is interesting. And the silence of his family is not an invitation to speculate more wildly in the absence of their voices. It is a boundary, and we should honor it. In 2022, when the FBI finally released their 133 pages of documentation, the case briefly returned to public attention. Journalists and researchers pored over the files, looking for new information or overlooked leads. Michael Bouchard, the author and investigator who had fought for years to get the files released, analyzed the documents and shared his findings. Some details were genuinely new, like the 1978 jailhouse confession and the 1980 interview with the suspected kidnapper. Others confirmed what had long been suspected, that the FBI had been involved in the case primarily as observers, that they had found no evidence of a crime, and that they had closed their active involvement relatively quickly. The files also revealed the FBI's assessment of Bill Martin's mental health, a detail that some found compassionate and others found patronizing. But the files did not contain the breakthrough that many had hoped for. They did not solve the case. They did not name a suspect definitively. They did not reveal some hidden piece of evidence that had been overlooked. They simply added more layers of context to a mystery that was already drowning in uncertainty. What the files did accomplish, perhaps unintentionally, was to confirm the fundamental tragedy of the case. Here was an institution, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with vast resources and nationwide reach, and even they could not determine what happened to a 6-year-old boy who vanished from a mountain meadow. If the FBI could not solve it, with their agents and their forensic labs and their databases, then perhaps no one could. Todd Matthews, the former director of the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, spoke about the case with the kind of quiet frustration that characterizes so many people who have worked on it. "I have a letter that one of the Martin family members sent to Richard Nixon," he said. "That is how big this was. This was not just a small case. This was a nationwide case. The rain made it harder to travel on foot. The people that were looking for remains or whatever was left, it makes it harder to track. I know they wanted to find him alive, but no trace was ever found. I mean, nothing. And that seems almost impossible. Almost impossible. That phrase captures it. Not impossible, technically, but so close to impossible that the distinction hardly matters. In more than 50 years, in a park visited by millions of people, in a case that has been studied and written about and discussed by thousands, not a single piece of physical evidence has been found to indicate what happened to Dennis Martin. Not one thing. Clay Jordan, the deputy park superintendent, offered what may be the most honest assessment of the case anyone in an official capacity has ever given. "I think it is virtually impossible that we will ever know what happened to Dennis Martin. Human nature being what it is, we want to have an answer to something. We want to have an explanation, but it has become one of the enduring mysteries of the Smokies." In 2024, the case was featured on the Hulu series Out There, Crimes of the Paranormal, in an episode titled Smoky Mountain Nightmare. The episode explored the abduction theory and introduced the case to a new generation of viewers. Whether renewed public interest will produce any new leads remains to be seen. But the pattern of the case has been consistent for more than 5 decades. Interest surges, attention focuses, people ask questions and review the evidence and propose theories, and then the interest fades, and the case settles back into the quiet category of the unsolvable. The mountain keeps its silence, the family keeps theirs, and so we come to the end of what we know, and to the beginning of what we can only feel. It is the spring of 2026 as I tell you this story. 57 years have passed since Dennis Martin stepped behind a bush at Spence Field and disappeared from the world. In that span of time, everything has changed, and nothing has changed. The world Dennis vanished from, the America of 1969, is almost unrecognizable now. The Vietnam War ended. The Cold War ended. The internet was invented. Phones became computers that fit in your pocket. Men walked on the moon 6 weeks after Dennis disappeared. And now private companies are sending rockets to orbit. The Knoxville that Bill Martin drove through on his way to Cades Cove has been built and rebuilt and built again. But the mountains remain. The Smokies do not change on human timescales. They change on geological timescales, which is to say they do not change at all in any way that matters to us. The same ridges that Dennis's grandfather Clyde walked as a young man are still there. The same streams that flooded on the night of June 14, 1969, still run through the same hollows. The same species of mountain laurel still bloom in the same meadows every June, indifferent to the passage of decades and the grief of families. Spence Field is still there. Hikers still walk through it on the Appalachian Trail, pausing to take photographs and eat their lunch and admire the view. The shelter where the Martin family camped has been replaced over the years as park structures are maintained and rebuilt, but the meadow itself is the same meadow. The grass grows in the same soil. The wind comes over the ridge from the same direction. If you stood at Spence Field on a June afternoon and closed your eyes, the sounds you would hear, the birds and the wind and the insects and the distant rustle of the forest, would be the same sounds that Dennis heard on the last afternoon of his known life. Most of the hikers who pass through Spence Field have never heard of Dennis Martin. The meadow gives no sign that anything happened here. There is no plaque, no memorial, no indication that this beautiful, peaceful place is also the site of one of the most agonizing unsolved cases in American history. The earth does not mark the spot where a father last saw his son. The bush that Dennis stepped behind is long gone, replaced by 57 years of growth and decay and new growth. The exact spot where he was last seen is unknown, lost to the imprecision of memory and the passage of time. And yet, for those who know the story, Spence Field will never be just a meadow again. It will always carry the weight of what happened here, the ghost of a question that has no answer, the echo of a father's voice calling a name that was never answered, the image of a red shirt disappearing into the green of the tree line. I want to take a moment here to talk about something that I think is important, something about the nature of unsolved cases and the way we, as listeners and readers and consumers of these stories, relate to them. There is a tendency when confronted with a mystery like this one to want to be the one who solves it, to read the details and form a theory and argue for it with conviction, to look at the evidence that exists and the evidence that doesn't exist and construct a narrative that feels satisfying and complete. This impulse is natural. It is, in many ways, what makes us human. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We want the world to make sense. We want stories to have endings. But the disappearance of Dennis Martin does not have an ending. It has an interruption, a sentence that stops mid-word, a door that opens onto darkness and does not close. And I think there is value in sitting with that, in not rushing to a conclusion, in allowing the discomfort of not knowing to exist without trying to fill it with speculation or theory. Because the not knowing is the truest thing about this case. It is the thing that Bill Martin lived with for 45 years. It is the thing that the rest of the family still lives with today. And it is the thing that connects us to them, if we let it. The shared human experience of confronting something that has no answer and learning to carry it anyway. I am not going to tell you what I think happened to Dennis Martin, not because I don't have thoughts, but because my thoughts are worth exactly as much as anyone else's, which is to say, they are worth nothing without evidence to support them. The case has been open for 57 years. The FBI investigated, the Park Service investigated, researchers and authors and journalists have investigated, and the answer remains the same. We do not know. What I can tell you is what we do know. We know that Dennis was loved. We know that his family searched for him with everything they had. We know that thousands of people gave their time and their effort and their hope to find him. We know that the search changed the way this country looks for missing people in the wilderness. And we know that despite all of it, Dennis Martin has never been found. These facts are enough. They are the foundation of a story that does not need embellishment or speculation to be devastating. A child was lost. A family was broken. A mountain kept its silence. That is the story. Bill Martin spent the last decades of his life in Knoxville, Tennessee. He went to work. He came home. He watched his other children grow up and have children of their own. He did the ordinary things that people do, the things that make up a life. But through all of it, under all of it, around all of it, there was the absence of Dennis. The chair at the table that was never occupied again. The bedroom that was never slept in again. The birthday that was never celebrated again. We do not know much about how Bill coped with this loss over the long years. The family's silence on the matter is complete. But we know certain things from the record. We know he wrote letters. We know he called the FBI. We know he followed up on leads. We know he talked to Michael Bouchard, the author. We know he believed until the end that Dennis was alive somewhere. And we know that he never gave up. There is a word for what Bill Martin did. It is not searching, though he did that. It is not hoping, though he did that too. The word is bearing. He bore the loss of his son the way you bear a weight that cannot be set down. Every day for 45 years, he picked it up and carried it. He carried it to work and to the dinner table and to bed at night and into his dreams. He carried it through holidays and through the anniversaries that came around every June like clockwork, each one marking another year that Dennis had been gone. He carried it until the carrying killed him, or until something else did. And then he set it down at last, not because he chose to, but because he had no choice. That is what this case does to the people at its center. It does not end. It cannot end, because there is no resolution to end it with. It simply continues, day after day, year after year, generation after generation, until the people who remember are themselves gone. Douglas Martin, Dennis's older brother, was 9 years old on the day his little brother disappeared. He was one of the boys who had planned the prank. He was the one who ran out from behind the bush and shouted and laughed while Dennis stayed hidden in the trees. Douglas is in his 60s now. He has lived his entire adult life with the knowledge that the last game he ever played with his little brother was the game that ended everything. We will not speculate about what that has been like for Douglas, because that would be an intrusion into a private pain that we have no right to narrate. But we can acknowledge it. We can hold space for the fact that this case did not happen to a collection of names and dates and theories. It happened to people, real people with real lives and real grief that extends across decades, and that will outlive the memory of anyone who reads about it. Have you ever been to the Great Smoky Mountains? If you have, you know what the light looks like in the late afternoon in June. That warm amber light that slants through the trees and turns the mist to gold. You know what the air feels like at 5,000 feet, cool and thin and clean, with the scent of balsam and wild roses and the particular earthy sweetness of a forest that has been rained on recently. You know the sound of the wind in the spruce trees on the high ridges, a soft, constant rush that sounds like the world breathing. It is one of the most beautiful places on earth, and it is a place where a 6-year-old boy disappeared 57 years ago and was never found. These two things exist simultaneously, the beauty and the tragedy. the peace of the meadow and the scream that Harold Key heard echoing through the valley, the golden light and the 3 inches of rain that fell on the night Dennis went missing, the mountain laurel in bloom and the hypothermia that kills a child in a matter of hours, the hikers walking through Spence Field with their cameras and their trail mix, and the bones that a ginseng hunter found scattered in a hollow 3 miles below. The Smokies do not resolve this contradiction. They simply hold it, the way they hold everything, in layers. Layers of stone and soil and leaf litter and time, each one pressing down on the one below, burying the past a little deeper with every passing season. If Dennis Martin is still in those mountains, and there is a reasonable chance that he has become part of them now. His atoms have been recycled through the soil and the water and the roots of the trees. He is in the leaf litter and the creek beds and the wildflowers that bloom at Spence Field every June. He is in the mountain itself as completely and as irrevocably as the billion-year-old stone beneath the topsoil. That is not a comforting thought, exactly. But there is something in it that is worth holding on to. Something about being returned to a place that your family loved. Something about becoming part of the landscape that your father and your grandfather walked through with reverence and joy. Something about the mountain not taking exactly, but receiving, absorbing, making whole again in its own slow, implacable way. I do not know if that is consolation. I am not sure consolation is what this story offers. What it offers, I think, is remembrance. The simple, stubborn act of saying a name and telling a story so that the person behind the name is not forgotten. Dennis Lloyd Martin. Born June 20th, 1962, in Knoxville, Tennessee. Last seen June 14th, 1969, at Spence Field in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, wearing a red t-shirt and green shorts, stepping behind a bush to hide, 6 days before his 7th birthday. Dark brown wavy hair, dark brown eyes with long eyelashes, about 4 feet tall, 55 pounds, a boy who loved the outdoors, a boy who had a dog named Lady, a boy who kept pace with the bigger kids, a boy who was loved. He has never been found. If you have any information about the disappearance of Dennis Martin, please contact the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the FBI, or your local law enforcement agency. The case remains open. After 57 years, the case remains open. And now, as we come to the end of this story, I want to thank you for staying with me through all of it. I know this was a long one, and I know it was heavy. These stories are not easy to tell, and I imagine they are not always easy to listen to. But I believe they are important. I believe that the people who are gone, the ones who never got their answers and never got their justice, deserve to have their stories told with care and with completeness, not sensationalized, not turned into entertainment, just told honestly and slowly, the way you would tell a story about someone you cared about, because we do care. That is why we are here. That is why you listen to all of this, because somewhere inside you, there is a part that recognizes the weight of a missing child, the weight of a question that has been hanging in the air for more than 50 years, and you feel that it matters. And it does. It matters. So tonight, wherever you are, whatever time it is, as you settle in and the room gets quiet and the world outside your window fades into the background noise of wherever you live, think about the mountains. Think about the way they look in the morning, when the mist rises through the trees and the first light catches the dew on the grass at Spence Field. Think about how old they are, and how much they have seen, and how much they hold within them, that we will never fully understand. And think of Dennis. Think of a small boy with dark brown hair and wide, curious eyes who went on a camping trip with his dad and his grandpa and his brother on Father's Day weekend, who was having the adventure of his young life, who was playing a game with the other kids, a silly, harmless game, the kind of game that children play in fields and forests everywhere, in every country, in every era, because that is what children do. They play, they laugh, they hide behind bushes and jump out and scare the grown-ups. Think of him stepping behind a bush at the edge of Spence Field. Think of the red shirt visible for just a moment against the green of the mountain laurel. Think of his father watching, not worried, not yet, just watching his boy do what boys do. Think of the moment when the red disappeared into the trees. Think of the silence that followed. Think of 3 to 5 minutes passing. Think of a father's voice rising, calling, receiving no answer. And then think of all the years that followed, all the searching, all the hoping, all the letters and the phone calls and the false leads, all the birthdays that came and went without Dennis, all the mornings that Bill Martin woke up and the first thing he thought of was his missing son. All the nights that Violet Martin went to bed not knowing whether her youngest child was alive or dead, not knowing and not being able to know, which is its own particular form of suffering. Think of the searchers, the rangers and the volunteers and the Green Berets and the Boy Scouts who walked those mountains day after day, looking for a little boy they had never met, driven by the simple human conviction that a missing child matters, that finding him matters, that trying matters, even when the trying fails. Think of Dwight McCarter, who spent his career in those mountains and who always believed that Dennis could have been found, who carried the weight of that belief for the rest of his life, who wrote about it and talked about it and tried to make sure that the lessons of 1969 were never forgotten, so that the next child lost in the Smokies might have a better chance. Think of Michael Bouchard, who fought the FBI for years to release their files, driven by the belief that the public had a right to know what had been discovered and what had not, who wrote a book about the case, not for money or fame, but because he believed the story needed to be told completely and accurately. Think of the ginseng hunter, who found bones in a hollow and kept the secret for 16 years because he was afraid, who finally told someone, decades too late, and who must have lived with the knowledge that his silence might have cost a family their last chance at answers. Think of all these people, connected across decades by one small boy who walked into the trees on a June afternoon and never came back. That is the constellation of this case. That is the community of grief and determination and failure and hope that Dennis Martin's disappearance created. It stretches from 1969 to today, and it will stretch into the future, as long as there are people who know his name and care enough to say it. His name was Dennis Martin, and he is still missing. Good night, everyone. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.